Welcome to Resiliency Redefined. I'm your host, Robyne, and I am thrilled to share with you information about resiliency, well-being, performance, education, business, parenting, and everything in between. I'm committed to joining you each week to talk about these big ideas and bring them into action, habits, tools, strategies, tactics that allow us to finally uncover what it takes to truly be well. And I'm just so excited that you're here. Welcome back to Resiliency Redefined. I'm excited to dive into the conversation that we started last week around women in work as we celebrate International Women's, let's just call it month. So I'm so appreciative that you are here. And I just want to hold space to recognize that just because we are talking about women and International Women's Day and women in work, this isn't just a conversation for women. This is a conversation where I want everyone at the table to be talking about these big ideas and just being aware of some of the considerations, some of the key ideas when it comes to supporting women in paid work and labor, essentially like outside of the home. And I'm not suggesting for a second that the work that folks who choose not to be in that occupational realm, that this is not a moral issue. This isn't good or better or anything. This conversation right now is about women in the paid workforce, because I've had so many people reach out and ask me about my experience, what it was like working in what we would call a male-dominated field, and just some of my thoughts about how I basically left the university and kind of pursued this other area of, we'll call it entrepreneurship or authorship, as a speaker, as a consultant. And just people have been really kind of curious about what that would look like and what that's all about. So I'm so glad you're here, because I would love to talk about some of these big ideas with you today. To get us started, one of the kind of areas, and this was a conversation that I started at an event last year, that in the Empowering Auto event, and Erin, she was an amazing kind of person to bring in, and we had this amazing conversation with some of her team. And what we talked about was just some of the realities about how women see themselves in the workplace. Now, I'll give you this example. The research shows, oh gosh, this gets me fired up. The research shows that when people are pursuing advancements in professional practice, so when they're applying for jobs, when they're applying for new opportunities, the research shows that men have a tendency of having, when they apply for a job, they would look at the job description for, let's say, key skills or training that you need. And we know men will actively pursue a job with as little as 2 of the 10 requirements. Okay, so essentially they're showing up, applying for this position or this promotion with like 20% of what the company is asking for. Women, when we look at the gender studies, when we look at the differences, women will hesitate, get that, hesitate to apply for a position if they only have 9 out of the 10 qualifications. So if a woman has 90% of the skills required, or training, or years of experience, whatever it is, if they have 90%, they'll like hesitate and they may put their hat in the ring. However, we know men will do that with literally 2 out of 10. And this is the fundamental difference that we see here. There's this expectation when we look at that research that men are okay learning on the job. So they're prepared to learn on the job those other, let's say 80% of the skills that are required. However, women have this idea that they have to have the skills before they land the job. So men give themselves permission to learn on the job. Women feel they need to have those skills before they even show up for that position. That's going to change the dynamic of who is putting their names forward. And again, why this is so important is because the way that we can address this, the way that we can do essentially an intervention around this like statistic that we see, is when people encourage other people to apply for the job. men and women. So if we want to see women advancing into practice and leveling up or skilling up or taking opportunities and promotions, we know that the best way to provide an intervention there is to tap someone on the shoulder and say, I think you'd be ideal for this position. I want to champion you for this position, and people will encourage them. And when we looked at the research as when women do take these higher promotions or these elevated practices, so often they say they had, man or woman, a person who encouraged them to take that risk, who encouraged them to put their name forward. This is a very big deal. And the reason I think this is such a big deal is it talks about the value and the importance of mentorship and how important it is that we show up for one another to be able to create equitable workplaces. Now, we know that the pay gap still exists despite a lot of the efforts. We know there's lots of conversation right now about the thoughts around inclusion and diversity in the workplace. And again, I think it's so important that within our systems, we can continue, and we do continue to understand these biases, or what we call the broken rungs on the ladder, that are really precluding women to be able to take on these other responsibilities if they so choose. Now, it doesn't mean everybody has to be like escalating to try and get themselves into that top tier of what they're doing. They need to be able to have the opportunity to choose whether or not that's something for them. Now, just to backtrack a wee bit, when I joined the academy, and again, this was the dream job. I appreciated being able to be part of this institution. I loved being able to work in a university. It brought so much security. It brought this idea of like, I was well positioned and resourced to support my young family. I absolutely loved the idea of working in the university. And I had so many highlights working in the university. I met some great people. I loved so many of the students I got to teach and support and learn from and learn with. I had great colleagues. And again, this is that dual truth piece. There were stressors and there was so much dysfunction as well. And these things can coexist. We can have our dream job, and the job can also be like absolutely like eroding our soul. And one of the things I learned very quickly, especially in the teaching side of it, is that I felt this pressure that I was supposed to show up in my role in the university as if I didn't have a family, especially a young family. But when I was at home, participating in lots of the different, little activities with the children, I felt as though I was supposed to show up there as if I didn't work outside of the home. So when I was in my role at the university, I felt pressure that I was supposed to work as if I didn't have kids. But then when I was with the kids, I felt pressure that I was supposed to be that primary parent and like everything should be about them. And we should be going to mother and goose classes and kinder music and all of the things. And I felt when I was, for example, shared that, I remember being in one mom and tot group and shared that, I had literally a weekend of a mat leave. I literally like had baby on Friday and was back to work Monday, because it was the end of the semester and it just kind of made sense and it was the best I could do in the moment. Like I was somehow like failing as a mother because I had a little one in daycare, right? So I just remember there being this tension, this significant tension. And I recall with Jack, so he was my littlest, and I recall, still is my littlest. And I remember, again, Jax was born and I went back right away. And I believe he started daycare, like he was very, very little when he started daycare in the infant room, like infant. And I remember going back into my post at the university very early and getting a call from daycare that he had some cold or something and I had to come pick him up because, as other caregivers can, I'm sure, relate to, if the nose is running or something's happening, we're getting that call. And I went into the dean's office at the time and I said, I need to leave because the daycare called and I need to go pick up Jax. And I remember the dean looked at me and said, can't he call somebody else to pick him up? Oh my gosh. I was like, he is a baby. Like, no, he can't call someone else. Like his caregiver is calling me to say, like, he needs mom to come, like he needs you to come and get him. And I remember looking at this dean and I'm just like, he's an infant. Like I don't have anyone else to call to come and get him. He doesn't have anyone else to call. Like I have to go get him. And the dean said to me in that moment, he said, I knew this wasn't going to work out. And I was like, what isn't going to work out? Like, and he's just like, it's not realistic to think that you can do this job with 3 kids. And I remember in that moment being like, I'm pretty sure you have a bunch of kids, right? Like I was like, wow. And it was one of the first times in this kind of moment where I realized that like I started to see the cracks, right? I started to see the cracks where again, I was just so connected to this idea of security and like the predictability of this job that and again, I wanted that stability. I wanted to be part of the institution that I started realizing like, you know what, this is so much against my value system. Like I felt so out of alignment. And again, I appreciate that there's enormous amount of privilege to be in a position to be able to leave and go pick up your child from childcare. I get it. And I remember thinking, I don't think you would say that to one of my male colleagues. And again, that's just such a small example. And I hear stories of women all the time sharing about like running into these barriers that weren't just about the work. It was so often about the how we were doing our work outside of the work. And the other kind of piece, just to kind of, acknowledge in that is again, it's this idea that our systems are very, very complicated in the sense that there's a lot of, like we talked about in the last episode, this like invisible labor. It's one thing about the work, but then it's like how we do the work. And again, these moving parts that I just want to hold space to say, like, this is a lot of work. It's hard. And I appreciate that people are showing up and doing the best they can. And again, maybe that dean was having a difficult day. I don't know. But in that moment, I just remember being like so frustrated, right? Just so frustrated that I just felt like I was in this dream job, but it was like eroding my heart. And this was just that start of that erosion and just kind of how do I see myself as a parent? How do I see myself as a professional? And again, I know that's just one example, and there's so many other examples out there in the world and big stories. And this brings us to the idea about how do we support women and one another in the workplace? Number one is tell our stories. I think it's so important that people understand and are given the opportunity to share their experiences with the people in their world, like people around them. I think we need to talk about these things. When these things happen behind closed doors and we don't even know, again, we don't even know what we do not know, right? And if you think about whenever we think about change, change happens. Probably one of the best predictors of change is when people get tired of their own BS, right? That's one of the personal drivers of change when people get fed up with how it feels. The other driver is that when a spotlight gets put on an issue that affects everyone or affects a particular group, right? So I'll change my behavior when eventually I get kind of fed up with myself. Change in society happens when all of a sudden we realize we're not alone and other people are having this experience. That's when we see some of the catalysts for social change. So I think talking about these stories, bringing them away from behind closed doors. Another kind of example when we think about this is where is it appropriate to tell our story? And I often let people know that not everyone is deserving of your story, right? When we share about our learned experiences and our lived experiences, I think it's really important that when we share our story, we wait until we have processed it. And what I mean by that is, I don't think it's really helpful in a lot of situations to tell open forum groups, like people at large, about our experiences until we've processed it. So that way we can talk about it from the lessons learned, that we're not actively still in it. So when leaders, for example, say, "Hey, Robyne, vulnerability is really important in the work. When, what story should I tell? How do I practice vulnerability?" Tell them about a time when you were in a learning experience or when you were in a difficult situation and you processed it, and this is the lessons to be gained from it, not when you're still actively trying to digest the experience. So again, sharing our stories, but with people or in scenarios or situations where you're doing so in a way that you feel safe. The other way I believe that we can support women in the workplace, and what we're seeing in the occupational research, is we need a wee bit of agency and flexibility. So when women have just a wee bit of agency and flexibility with how they do their work, we will see the byproduct of loyalty. So you give me just a little bit of wiggle room for me to adapt, to be able to manage and be able to be part of my other responsibilities outside of the work. And then you, in return, are going to get loyalty. So what we learned, especially in our research around burnout, It wasn't the work per se that was burning people out. It was, again, we've talked about the time outside of your values. So if you're feeling awful because you are missing taking your relative to a doctor's appointment, or you're missing your kid's childhood because you're so busy stick handling all of this, that's the parts that eventually are going to create the biggest impact of leading to burnout. When we live outside of our values, when we feel out of integrity or out of alignment. So, if we want our top performers to stay, if we want women to be able to have great success in the workplace, we know that little bit of agency is going to make a big difference. The other part I think is so important is that we need to be one another's cheerleader. And what I mean by that is I love dropping people's names in rooms that they are not in terms of setting them up for success, right? So, talking about people in a really positive light when it's a good fit, when that person isn't even in the room, I think that's one of the greatest things that we can do for one another. To be able to say, like, yeah, I was so excited that project launched. It did. But you know what? It launched so successfully because of Jenna, right? Because Jenna was there stick handling that project. And I want to give a shout out to her. So, speaking and cheering on each other and encouraging each other outside of the workplace, like outside of that kind of the meeting or whatever situation, I think is really important. And I also think from an altruistic perspective, yes, it's good for other, but it also puts you in a good light as well. When we share the recognition, right? I think that's a really important skill set to be able to have. None of us are meant to do this alone. And if you get to the top of your field and you're alone, I don't think you did it right. I think we're meant to be able to build each other up and create opportunities for one another. The other idea there, we already touched on at the top of the show, is this notion about cheering each other on, but also encouraging people to take those risks. Letting somebody know, like, I see you as somebody who would do really great in that role. I see you as someone who would be able to really lead in a really meaningful way, or whatever it is. Speaking our confidence over people sometimes is that little nudge or that encouragement that they may need to be able to, like, take that leap, to be able to jump. The other idea that I also want to encourage us to think about is I heard this just recently about getting ourselves in positions as professionals where we are attaching ourselves to the mission, to the work, not necessarily the organization or a particular leader. Now, that feels like it's almost going counterintuitive to what we were just talking about loyalty, but I do believe that some of our learning and some of our experiences that they have seasons. And I think we get to a point where it's okay to recognize, I think it's time to move on. Perhaps it's because it's toxic and we want to get you out of, really unhealthy environments, or perhaps it's just like, okay, you know what? I've kind of done my time here, and it's okay to see what is next, and not staying in situations longer than we should or we need to or we ought to, under that sense of loyalty. Like, there is a place for loyalty, but we also want to make sure that we're able to grow, that we're able to level up and skill up. And really great leaders, I think, recognize that we want to not necessarily create smaller versions of ourselves or different versions of ourselves. We want to help people see their potential and help them find their through line for how they can be of greatest service, what that's going to look like for them. So, again, attaching yourself to the work, your vocation, your mission, maybe that isn't so much attaching ourselves to an organization. And I've shared this before as well. Whenever you're in a situation when it comes to occupational behavior in the workplace and you're kind of stuck between like your family or work, whatever your family system is, my invitation is to always pick your family. You will not regret picking your family. If we miss out on, let's say, our children's childhood, or perhaps it's our, again, other relationships or experiences, I don't think any of us are going to be in our final days thinking like, oh, I just wish I would have had another Zoom call before my time was up. I wish I could have written that other report. I wish I could have just one more tax season to be able to sign off, right? Like, we're going to miss the people. We're going to miss the experience. The other little idea to bring into here as well, and I hope this is resonating with you, is the importance of having friendships at work. having friendships at work. Now, this goes against, I think, some of the principles that a lot of us were conditioned with, where, they're colleagues, they're not our friends. Now, on that note, I believe in having friends in the workplace. I'm not a huge advocate of necessarily referring to the workplace as a family. I like to think of them as a team, right? I think of it as a team. We can have really close relationships, but I think that the word family, I think that's a very sacred word, whatever you want to call that family. But I think that's like, again, to be mindful of the fact that like family represents something pretty significant. And yeah, we can have really close relationships, and I want you to have friends in the workplace, but recognizing that there are a few sacred roles outside of how we define ourselves by our professions that I think we need to ensure that we're taking care of. Now, the other kind of idea, just to kind of, organize this, try to land this plane, so to speak, is when we think about women in the workplace, one of the kind of final takeaways is to recognize that women at the bottom, they're competing against each other. Women at the top are collaborating, seeing the good work of one another, cheering them on, putting their names forward. I believe all of this is going to create more opportunities, and thinking about equitable work practices when we start seeing how well we can collaborate at the top, how well we can lift each other up. The last piece I'm going to send you off here is also this idea that our profession, whatever it is, that is part of our identity, is not the whole story, right? So you're a person who practices as a nurse. You're a person who is a teacher. You're a person who is an accountant. You're a person who is an agent. You're a person who is this, whatever that is. Please keep the people ahead of the job. And why that is so important is because I think when we position ourselves to see the humanity in one another, I think a lot of the behaviors that we share in the workplace become a lot more aligned with kindness, empathy, and compassion. I think it creates these places where we get to be these multidimensional beings who are people who happen to have a lot of these skills, but those skills don't define us, nor is it an evaluation of our worth. So, for example, one of the questions that we ask in society so often is like, what does that person do? And depending on what that person does, on some level, it like garners a particular degree of respect. But when we start seeing each other as people first who happen to have skills and talents and gifts, I think it radically transforms how we see one another in and outside of the workplace. So, my friends, thank you for listening. I feel like I have landed that wee little plane. I'm feeling pretty good about where we are. I'm excited to jump into a new topic next week. As always, if you have any questions, wonderments, curiosities, please ask. I want to be useful. I'm here to help, and I appreciate joining you today, wherever you happen to be listening. Thank you for making time for this. I'm really glad that we get to spend this time together. Take good care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Thank you for spending time with this podcast episode today. I hope you found something helpful in Resiliency Redefined. Please feel free to share it with somebody who you might think could benefit. Maybe there was something useful, something in particular that you think you could pay forward. Also, if you have a moment, please feel free to rate and review this podcast wherever you like to listen to your podcast. It means the world to me. And again, thanks for your time. Thank you for your interest. Take good care, and I'll see you next time.